So guys, girls, everybody, welcome back to spaceexplr. We have an episode 126 and a very special guest. Obviously, we've been discussing these things before, but to get a different point of view and different knowledge, again, and this man is coming from a different part of the world. So it's always good to get a different perspective of what's happening in the space industry, especially when it comes to policy, space law, and all these different complicated things that most of us don't understand. So that's why today we have Antonio, who's going to be explaining us what is happening in this industry when it comes to the space law, any news updates, and kind of projecting towards the future. So all these great news. So make sure to continue to stick in and watch this episode because it's going to be great. So without further ado, again, Antonio, thank you again for coming over today. I really appreciate your time.
Hi, Martinez. Thank you again for having me on the show. It's also great to be talking about space policy. It's a very new field. It's relatively new. At the same time, space law and policy has been around for more than a few decades, but it's only come into the highlight in the last decade, last half decade, due to the explosion of private spaceflight and other actors into the foray, as well as like many emerging countries coming onto the space industry in the aerospace field. So I'm very happy to talk about this topic. There's a lot of new interest here, a lot of new questions, a lot of new topics that are previously kind of disregarded as science fiction is now coming to foray. So I'm very excited to talk about these topics. Briefly about me, I'm currently the Asia Pacific Regional Partnerships Manager at the Space Generation Advisory Council, the logo of which can see my background. I'm also the East Asia Regional Coordinator for the Moon Village Association, alongside holding various positions at other organizations such as the Conrad Foundation or the National Space Society. But yeah, apart from that, we can head right into the topic. Martinez, you can fire me with any questions, just like space policy, space law, space regulations. Mind you, they all sound similar, but they're all very different. Law is one thing, policy is another, different branches that handle it. Space diplomacy is one thing. Planetary protection, planetary defense, these are new words that's also being thrown out a lot more in the sci-fi realm that has been encroaching into the real world. But just briefly speaking, planetary defense is talking about defending the planet against extraterrestrial threats such as asteroids that might hit Earth. Planetary protection is protection of outer space bodies whenever we're exploring the moon or Mars, just to ensure that we don't introduce any new microbiome or like new organisms to them. Space traffic management, space situational awareness, these are topics that is more down to earth about when we're talking about different space domains, what belongs to who, and what do we have to do to really track a lot of different space assets. We can talk about spacecraft, manned spacecraft, unmanned spacecraft, satellites, high altitude balloons. All of these kind of go into the whole space traffic management, space situational awareness sector. There's also long-term sustainability of space. The UN COPIA has been working a long time. Again, there's a variety, there's an infinite amount of topics we can go into. So you can hit me with questions and I can start answering them.
So let's start with the start. As you mentioned, like 10 years ago, because of the private sector in the space industry, they decided, I don't know who are they, and maybe you can give us understanding who is creating these policies and these laws. Is it the one companies that based on every country, they have to come up with some sort? Because obviously we have the space treaty, right, which is really outdated. So like 10 years ago that happened. So what other changes, besides looking at the space treaty, what other changes are been implemented where this kind of commercialized of space was kind of started 10 years ago?
Right. So in terms of space treaties, or like in like cohesive and consistent international treaties, there hasn't been really much updates since we had the outer space treaties back in the 20th century. We had 4 other space treaties that are sort of widely recognized. We've had other treaties and conventions such as the Moon Treaty, etc., that were introduced, but they were not ratified nor legalized. So in terms of the International Space Treaty goes, we have the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs, which manages and maintains and provides administration to the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, or the UN COPUOS. And UN COPUOS is the international UN governing body, like the UN body that oversees matters when it comes to outer space, and Outer Space Treaty was more was formed in connection to UN COPUOS. At the same time, international treaties don't have legal standing on their own unless you have signatories and you have ratified parties. So signatories are basically countries that come in and sign these treaties and say, I agree with the provisions here, but at the same time, they still don't have much of legal ramifications unless the countries until the country is like ratified, which basically says that you have these international treaties and then you make these into national law. So only when it's ratified does it like have more of an enforcement regime. And the number of countries that have signed and ratified a particular treaties says a lot about how enforceful or how like powerful certain treaties are. But even then, even recently, you can't, the fact that a country has ratified a certain treaty means that their own regime, their own countries abide by those rules, and other countries can say, hey, you agreed to this treaty, so hence give us these benefits or something else. Whether or not the country will recognize and abide by those claims is something else, because again, these treaties are self-enforced by each country, and the extent of that enforcement is kind of domestic. So for example, when China launched a space station, and when it crashed back into the Pacific very near the Maldives, or when I'm just talking about China here because they've had a lot of these infractions that they've done to these treaties. When a lot of the countries, they launch their, they have their launches conducted over the sea. So whenever you have all these rocket parts that fall off, during the launches, they fall into the sea. But China, being more of a mainland player, they launch these rockets, and some of these rocket parts get impacted or get washed up in other countries because of the geolocations of China. They have all these countries to the east of them. So some of these parts come down to the sea. There's a lot of pollutants that come in, and all of these countries can sue China and say, you have infringed, or by the UN treaty, you're obligated to pay us a compensation for polluting our waters, or for having your space station fall into our waters. But how much is that damage? How much is the who is going to conduct that assessment? How much is that assessment going to be? If China says that you say your damage is this much, but we're only going to pay this much of the damages, can they file a claim against that? That's a lot more legal. That's a lot more legal procedures out there.
So let me just ask a question. So is it possible, again, obviously, because the space law and policy, it's a little bit advanced than it used to be before, right? And we have all the people throughout the world, including yourself, who are involved in that, and they're doing a lot of research and work to make a few changes and to make things better when it comes to deorbiting. And obviously we had like this, what is called Long B5 March rocket not long ago. Just everybody was observing the news where it's going to fall down, like another issue not long ago, right? So is it possible in the cases when it drops in the ocean versus when it drops in the land, is it possible, even going to this kind of fantasy world, to create some sort of a, let's call it price lists, right? If that's in that case, if you know, like accident happens, this is the fee that you have to pay. And is that doable, or you have to look on a kind of big case by case basis because it's just too complex?
It's always a case by case here. Like there's nothing really can say about it. Again, the Outer Space Treaty was over was decades ago in the making, and back then they didn't really anticipate this type of launches. They did not expect this amount of launch frequencies that we are seeing right now. Like we are launching rockets globally like once every week or so, and that's an amazing amount of launches that we're conducting right now. The Outer Space Treaty did not account for that. We didn't anticipate this much. debris falling to the ocean. And the thing is, the countries that are most on the benefiting side of the lack of regulations are the ones who are the ones who's going to be most powerful at the table. It's kind of similar to the colonial times, where you didn't really want a law on what you can do in global colonization, because the powers like the British, the Spanish, the powers that had that kind of wielded supreme power at the negotiating table were the ones who benefited the most by not having such stringent negotiations in place. So we're kind of trying to balance the table here. And so that's where we have the long-term sustainability, or the LTS of sustainability, that comes into place, because we want to introduce certain legal instruments there that allows, I mean, right now we have this kind of, I won't call it an arms race, but we do have some sort of a new space race conducted right now in terms of the orbits, in terms of the cislunar infrastructure and cislunar space. So the whole point of LTS to ensure that the latecomers to the parties, especially from emerging countries, can have a say in how space assets are allocated and what kind of retributions can be done. Like if some countries have an overwhelming majority of low Earth orbit, and if other countries want to put their satellites up there, but if like it's populated primarily by the United States, China, and India, then can they say that the United States, India, and China have to compensate for the overwhelming amount of satellites that are already up in there, and for all the hazards that they have created? That's kind of like the extension of this thing. Like if you have like space assets falling into the sea, can you sue them? Can you say this is the amount that you pay? Same thing. It's case by case. There's no international agreement. There's a lot of proposals, but again, that's where it stops. It stops at the proposal stage, because no administration wants to go in and kind of chain themselves into having to pay these amounts, because they're the ones who have to be paying all these fines and regulations.
So the question is now, again, as you speak about this space race, kind of, which obviously I feel the same. It feels like something like that's happening, like I never experienced, because obviously I wasn't around when the space race between, you know, NASA and Russia was going, who's going to be the first in space when it comes to satellite, first man on the moon, and all these things, first man in space. So now it feels the same. So again, we have a rapid growth of innovation. We have all these different companies that we already know, and probably we're going to see many more in upcoming months or probably years, you know, becoming part of the space sector. So how fast is obviously, because there is a drastic rapid growth in the technology sector. So how much of that growth, is it equal? Is it same? Is it less of a growth? Because for the space policy, because like I see these new companies, they popping up and they're creating companies, and somebody is regulating them, or because of this, what I'm trying to say, because of this huge growth, is the policy and law will be able to catch up what's happening in the space industry, or that will be just gonna, it will lead to some drastic point?
That's a question that is again case by case. So the one case is the United States. The United States have more of I mean, the United States, like the one country that has a good regulating grip on the space sector, especially during the Trump administration. The Trump administration has been able to file quite a few space policy directives that were signed by the president, giving a lot of oversight and oversight and integrating a lot of the executive powers out there in the FCC, the FAA, and other executive branches and functions, and they've been able to integrate all those things. But at the same time, they can do that because different executive branch functions have been conducting this program for decades. They've been have the control over the wavelength, in terms of regulating what gets sent up into back from space. They've been regulating a lot of different spacecraft and private flights, and usually air flights, but now it's going over the space flights as well. They've had all these regulations in place. All they had to do was kind of modify them, integrate them, and make them cohesive under one administration, and make it streamlined. That's what the US has been able to do. For a lot of emerging countries, they did not have that type of thing, and they also can't adopt the US infrastructure outright because their infrastructure is very different, and how their legal instruments work also very different. And most importantly, their market is very different. A lot of countries don't even have the kind of the space launch sector that the US can boast. Only comparable is China and Japan, where they have private space flight capabilities, as well as the Europe with Arianespace. Apart from that, a lot of their launches is still happening mostly on governments, or even if they have private space launch capabilities, a lot of their customers are still the government. So it's still a very government-centric model for space regulation, while for the US and for other great powers, they've been able to expand their regulatory powers to the sector and been able to give them permissions. And how is this different is that in the private space sector, you need a lot of these approval, and whether or not you can get this approval or not, and whether or not you have that forecasting out there, how long does it take to get it approved? How, like, what kind of regulation, what kind of bus do you require for your satellite? What kind of wavelength do you require? This type of regulatory approval gives you an estimate of the timeline and the budgetary approval that it will take to develop a certain type of hardware in a space project. For governments, even if you don't have that kind of clearly set out, if it's a government project, it's relatively okay. You can always ask for an expansion of the project, or because you're the government entity that's doing the project, you can ask for it to be expedited. But if you're a private sector, then the road is so much less clear for you. The forecasting is so much more difficult. That means that you can't talk to investors and say, hey, we can have this launch in about 5 years. We can have the satellite system up in 5 years. We can have this blueprint within the next year or so, because you simply don't have that clarification up within your government. That's why a lot of private space sectors in other countries are having such a hard time trying to get up to speed to the United States, because the regulations are not there. And the regulators, when they try to come up with regulations, don't really have a coherent picture when they're looking at it, because it's all very small space companies that have all these different needs. In the US, you have this amazing diversity of needs. We can say, this is the majority, this is the way that the regulations will go. For other countries, they don't have that. Well, they could try to kind of customize the regulations for one company, but that would alienate another company that's coming down the road with potentially a much larger space sector that can help. So that's the regulatory market that we're looking at globally right now.
So the question is, obviously, like, when we speak about developing countries and applying the laws or the policies, like, how big of a problem, let's say, for somebody who is looking to develop a company in developing country, like, how many of these roadblocks, thresholds they will have to go through to, and maybe you can talk about, because I'm pretty sure you came across a similar startup company who had similar problems. So maybe you can explain, and maybe somebody's watching in one of those developing countries, and so they can understand how much work actually will it take for them to have these talks with all the people in a government, and what type of rules and regulations they could potentially either pitch them, or what they can provide from their side, and make this process, which is laborious and long and difficult, make it a little easier for them.
It really it really depends on the government side, and it really depends on government strategy. This is why in the space policy side, we really try to advocate for different governments to come up with a national space policy that gives out a long-term guideline of what their space missions are going to be like. For example, in India has said that they're going to reach the moon, and they're going to have a human space flight capability to the moon by a certain year, and that's their national space paradigm. That's the national space policy. And given that guideline, that kickstarts a lot of new regulations down the road. And okay, if you want human space flight to the moon, you need to have human space flight capabilities to a potential low Earth orbit. Do you want to do a mission in orbit before you go to the moon? For which then you need a set of different regulations. If you have a goal in place, then that opens up, if you have a milestone in place, then that opens up the doors to getting a lot of these regulations in place before that goal has to be set. And if you have a certain timeline, that also allows you to kind of give you a density of what changes need to be made in the regulatory procedure, because it's not simply about just having the things out there. In law and in the terms of law, when you have the law enacted, and if it passes, and if it's stepped into law, that's it. for regulatory regimes, the law is just a start. Then you have to get all the staffers, you need to get all the all the departments, all the branches in there. You have to have new personnel trained to be able to deal with a lot of the processes. So when you have that milestone and the timeline, you can actually feasibly say, this is the amount of personnel that we need to be able to handle all the problems that we foresee within that given time frame. And India is currently working towards that with their new moon mission. Another success story is New Zealand and Australia. I mean, it's maybe a bit too early to say that it's a success story. We haven't seen the results yet, but Australia and New Zealand, with the establishment of their space agencies following the privatization of the space sector, following the government mandate that said that space and aerospace industry is going to be one of their key agendas, is going to be one of the key pillars in their industry when they see 50 years out. And with that said, they've established a space agency, they've given a new protocol to the different ministries and the executive branches that they had, and they've been able to get a kickstart on a lot of the executive branches and been able to attract a lot of the space companies and space investments and finances to be headquartered or be partially based out of Australia and New Zealand. And the another success story is Luxembourg, where they said we can't outweigh all the other European powers technological, but we can outweigh them by having a very robust legal infrastructure and by giving a lot of rights to different space, especially for deep space operations. They've been able to attract a lot of different commercial space sector into Luxembourg. They've been able to attract a lot of finances to Luxembourg, wedded with the government finances that have been newly opened, and been able to make Luxembourg like a hub for deep space exploration and investment and for the European side. So this is just some ways a government can kickstart the space sector in the domestic economy.
Okay, gotcha. So the quick answer, for the people who are looking, as I said, to develop a company in developing country, can you do that without actually having these conversations? And obviously, let's say if you're having a launch provider in a different country, but still your satellite crosses the orbit of the country that you're in, can you do that sort of a mission without going to anybody and having this conversation and talking about the space policies that I'm having the satellite mission, I want to do this? Would that require having this conversation, or this is kind of independent thing? Because obviously we see individuals and students, but maybe that applies more to the States because obviously they're well developed with the space policies and everything. So it's probably they have everything figured. But in that case where there's a developing country, can you do that without going and speaking with these people, or that would be completely legal?
Is it legal is a very tantalizing question. So in the US side, the US is a more preemptive regulatory regime. You have to get all the approval prior to your launch, prior to your operation of satellites, for you to have a nominal operation. And US can do that because they have the manpower to go through the mission and anticipate problems before the people who's trying to operate a satellite has even identified that this could be a potential problem. Like you have different executive branches and functions that say, won't this be a problem? But for most other countries, they do not have that infrastructure in place. Yeah. So most of the times it comes down to you only know about a problem after it has occurred. So for a lot of the companies, if you can have the capacity to ask, would this be a problem of us operating out to a different country, us taking imaging for different land areas or different different oceans, that usually happens only after you've operated. So for example, you can say you happen to take a picture of a US military base installation. Maybe taking that photo might not have been illegal, but when you're trying to sell it, then that could be illegal because that could go against US and international law of placing another country's national security in jeopardy. So the problems can be detected at various levels, and trying to mitigate that problems can also come in different levels. But right now, in terms of law and regulations, it's more like you have to have the problem first before you can act on it.
Very interesting. So thank you for sharing that. That's some really valuable information, again, for the people who are looking to develop a company. Obviously, there are probably more than a few watching or listening to this episode right now. So this is something to think about, because sometimes we just think about if it's a startup, new company, and I don't know, again, if those people haven't experienced prior to starting companies, space industry, if they understand what does it take to create a company, raise capital, all these different parts. But we forget about this thing, which is obviously space is developing industry still. And as we speak about these policies and laws, we cannot overlook them and think like this is not an important piece, because it is part of the mission. Is speak now, if you're going to be selling data to a company, right, and providing that as a service, you know, that data could be illegal based again on the rules or regulations if they're not in place for that. So this is, yeah, very important. So what about the lack of legal agreements? Because you remember you mentioned that it depends on a case-by-case basis when it comes to their own space policies and laws that they have in place. So let's say US, comparing that to China, they have separate internal laws for themselves, right? But we talk about these global issues. So how many of these legal agreements, how much of that is lack of it actually in the marketplace right now to make sure that we keep this kind of peaceful use of outer space?
Right, areas that has the most lack of legal agreements is currently outer space. So in orbit, we have a pretty, I mean, it can be much better, but we still have some agreements or de facto agreements on how to operate on orbit, how to not infringe on another satellite or another country's space assets, territory, or not to endanger it. But where we really lack international legal agreement is when we talk about cislunar space, or when we're talking about asteroids or any other planetary bodies out there. But right now, the moon is becoming a hotbed because we have a lot of missions, a lot of countries really interested in it, especially in utilizing the resources on the moon, especially the ice on the polar ice caps of the moon. Who owns it? Can you find it? Can you mine it? Can you own it? Can you occupy a land? Can you sell it? Can you provide legal rights to it? If you have an astronaut there, what rules do they have to follow? What assets can you deploy? That also goes to other planetary bodies as well. You've already seen the Martian movie, in the movie Martian, where Matt Damon kind of has a problem, but he still uses U.S. Architecture and infrastructure. But what happens if Mars is also colonized? You have, and I mean, if it's on the moon, you have a lot of different moon bases and stations in there. And when you have an American astronaut that is in jeopardy, but for him to survive, he sees a Chinese or Russian moon base over there that is currently unmanned. There's no one there, or a research lab or an asset. Can he go there, pluck it out, and then try to use it to contact the Americans? Can the Chinese prohibit the use of that? What regulations apply? And this is where we also have an expansion of the maritime rule and law, where you have, where in the maritime rule, if you have an SOS for a ship, then any other ship that is within the range that can help is kind of obligated to help, and then return that sailor to safety. Can a similar type of regulation apply to the moon as well, where if an astronaut of a foreign soil is identified to be in jeopardy, then all other countries have a legal mandate to provide legal assistance to that astronaut and to use their assets to it. But at the same time, if you have like national secrets that's going to reveal through that procedure, how do you have this international mandate to help a human life versus the mandate of your own country to safeguard your own national security, which could jeopardize other assets? Like by helping this astronaut, you unveil and you can put your own astronaut's life at risk. How do you weigh those decisions? It's all case by case. There's no regulations or international agreements that really delves deep into this. And then, you know, you have the whole ownership for asteroids and whatnot as well.
So do you believe that this is going to happen once we're going to move to the moon and Mars? It's going to be case by case basis. And obviously, if it's US versus Russia's or China's base, they will have those regulations on a case by case basis. So do you think long term, we're just going to kind of carry it through? Because I heard some of the talks, some of those were Elon Musk, where he dreams about having this, you know, one planet with people on the same mission and one like same rules and regulations will apply for those people. I mean, how realistic is that versus having case by case scenarios where we have, again, borders again, rules, regulations, everything's pretty much same as Earth. So it's going to be Earth 2.0 when it comes to policy and law. So are we going to expect that, or what do you think is going to happen in that process?
So the one Earth, one rule, it's a very it's an aspiration that we all would love to have, and we also have a lot of amazingly smart, intelligent people working on such kind of a regime. But at the same time, in the near future, no, it's most likely not going to happen. It will happen on a case-by-case basis, because more than anything, so you had legal instruments, you had legal treaties, and then you have the actual regulatory system that manages how these laws are enforced. At the same time, on the later part, you have the interpretation of the laws, which always operate on a case-by-case basis. So even if we somehow managed to get an international and comprehensive treaty on how to deal with ownership of assets on the moon and the dealing of human life on the moon, it will still come to debate on the legal interpretation and how will you be able to interpret it. Like, how can you say that this person is in great danger? Like, what counts as danger? What counts as ownership? You can say, oh, we recognize the ownership of assets on the moon. To what does it entail? Like, the fact that you recognize ownership doesn't mean that, oh, you have an asset on the moon. That means that asset is yours. You have assets by which that vehicle is there. You are not supposed to endanger that asset, but by placing that asset there, you also having a de facto ownership of the asset around it, because if you can legally and reasonably say that if you encroach a certain boundary, you will damage or you will place that asset into jeopardy. Let's say you purposefully place a certain instrument that is very sensitive to electromagnetic signatures. That means that any other assets can't come into a certain boundary. That asset may or may not be useful, but by placing that asset there, a country could have a certain range in which they would not be able to allow any other country to encroach it. And who knows what other activities that country might be able to do in that certain area. Who knows that area happens to be an area that is very rich in lunar ice or helium-3 deposits. That does that mean that you give them legal recognition of those deposits? So these are all the problems that it comes into interpretation of these languages of threat, of danger, or national security. This is all interpretation problems that will always happen as a case-by-case basis, even if you have international agreement on the terms and the laws.
Yeah, so that could be one of the cases. Again, if you're saying, you know, like when it comes to obviously like life or death situations, coming back to that point, and you mentioned that a couple of times. Obviously, like this is very complex, and how do you account all these different policies and rules and understand what the rules and regulations are, so and what is yours, and that moment where human life is in danger, right? You're not going to be thinking about probably, and that's where the humans make the errors, right? And that's where conflicts happen and things like that, right? That's how things go. So what do you think, instead of using, and obviously we're working on that, I'm not sophisticated in machine learning or artificial intelligence, but how much of that could be applied into making those crucial 1-second decisions when it comes to the space policy and like those moments, life or death?
Well, there won't be much help. It's the same thing, life and death situation that's happening in Iraq and Afghanistan, or whether or not you can like identify something as a threat to your forces. Like, is that truck containing Taliban threats, or is that containing armed forces? Can you positively identify, or like PID all of them to be insurgents or threats, or do you have like civilian members on that thing? Like these all require split-second decision making. After decades of war, war against terror, the U.S. still has not been able to come up with a good paradigm and legal infrastructure to make these split-second decisions, and I really doubt that we'll be able to have one in outer space as well, when the laws are harder to define.
Yeah, because they're using human factor, and that's why I'm asking how much of that we can use the technology to implement those decisions where we need to make a decision, and we don't want to have a human factor, and we have to have a call with the ground station with the president of the United States, and this is happening like we see in the movies. How much in the future, again, we can rely on the technology and we can control the input, which is the rules and regulations when it comes to policy, and there's going to be a mix of that, and based on that mix, the machine learning or the technology wouldn't come up with a certain like answer for this specific scenario.
Yeah, so again, this is the thing, like even in orbit, we have all these unknown scenarios that we try to prepare for. For example, we have a US satellite that is like crucial and vital to the US communication and other infrastructure, and you see another asset that is coming towards you that would damage your satellite. And how do you contact the country on the other side of the party? If that country says that that is a rogue satellite, we don't have control over that, how much can you believe them? Like, how much do you believe that they do not have the ability to reorient that satellite so it doesn't have a collision course?
But this is a little bit, sorry for interrupting. So this is a little bit different case, because how you can make a split decisions when it's like when the object is traveling 20 plus maybe 1,000 like miles per hour. Like we're talking about the situations where the human being, let's say there's two different moon bases and somebody's is doing an EVA and they're experiencing a malfunction of the spacesuit, and the closest base for them to travel is the other country's base. Obviously, because of the rules, this is our base, our territory, you cannot come in. So on those like scenarios, how can we mitigate the risk, or just to help a human being, or like can technology help in that? Sorry for interrupting again.
Yeah, no, because I mean, I actually think it's a very similar scenario, because you it still requires split-second decisions. And the thing is, what we are into here is a probabilistic risk theory. It's all about probability, so you don't have a certain danger to you. Most of the dangers that are happening in space right now are probabilistic. Yes, they're like all these satellites, but you can predict certain trajectories of satellites. Yes. You can say, oh, that satellite has what percentage of coming into your view and crashing into you. And it could be that the other party has a malintentions, a malicious intent to actually destroy your satellites, for which you send in an ASAT missile to destroy the other satellite. What's the repercussions of that? And similar cases can happen on the moon as well. Like when you have a human life in danger by another party's activity, it's like another moon base has an asset that they claim is rogue, but at the same time they say it is rogue, but it is our asset, don't destroy it. But you see that asset is traveling in a trajectory that could harm your own national security. It might be encroaching, it might be headed towards human life, it might be headed towards moon base. The thing is, it's probabilistic. We don't know. We might not have anyone there, but you see that an activity in a Chinese lunar station has sent up debris that is traveling and would crash into an oxygen depot for US moon bases. No one is there. No one's gonna get hurt. But if that oxygen base, if that oxygen depot is destroyed, then American lives could be at danger long term. They might have to cut their mission short. They would have less redundancy. At the same time, you don't know whether or not that asset coming towards you from the Chinese moon base, is that debris? Is that a Chinese asset, like hardware? You don't have any ID. You don't have like any identification. If that is just like lunar soil. If that's actually like metal hardware, if that could have packed explosives into it. The Chinese aren't saying anything about it. What are you gonna do? You still have to make split-second decision. It's all probabilistic on how much threat it poses, how much of a repercussion it has. It's all similar probabilistic scenarios, and it in the end it comes up to who has the decision making. Technology does play a role in giving you a quantitative assessment rather than a qualitative assessment. That is happening in the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. People can say that there has been a probabilistic quantitative assessment on this threat, rather than just someone saying, I think it was a threat. Having a number there gives you legal standing on presenting your case after the fact. So let's say if the American base has, okay, that is gonna hit our lunar hit our oxygen depot, so we sent missiles or like any other projectile to intercept whatever that's coming. And it happened to be a very important research material from the Chinese moon base. And it did happen, the Chinese didn't actually intend it to go there. It just like happened to, like, they have a misfire. That very important instrument is now destroyed by a US interceptor missile. And it also came out that it wasn't actually going that close to the oxygen depot as well. It happened to fall, if you allowed it, it would have fallen somewhere else, but the US did not know it. But again, having those numbers out there allows you to present the case that yes, it did not actually present or pose a threat, but in that time we had reason to believe that it did pose a significant and irreversible threat to American lives on the moon. And that is why this is the limit of the legal compensation and ramifications that we will present to the Chinese authorities, because the Chinese, you also have, based on these prediction figures, you should have also known certain figures. You should have also given us a certain data with the onset of this problem. You have not done your side of the contract, your side of the social agreement, and that is why we're only going to compensate you about this much. Having those numbers there, having that technology in there allows you to present that case. And in these cases, the country or the party that with more data at hand is a country that's going to have more out of these agreements. That's why we have all this SSA or space situational awareness right now on Earth, because a lot of countries are saying, knowing what happens over your heads, over your sovereign space, having that data to you available gives you that power to appeal or sue in International Court of Justice, that right to say, this is why we believe we should have certain rights, or we believe that the other countries infringe on our rights, so and so.
Gotcha. So this is a very good point, and definitely this is very similar to what you said. So thank you for explaining. So again, as we speak about this topic, like, it always feels like there's always two sides. There's one side, again, case by case basis, right? Every single time we're talking about the country, again, we have no one rule basically that applies to all the countries, right? So, and obviously we see this rule book, if we can call it, right, when it comes to the law, it's not getting thinner. It just gets thicker and thicker, and there's more and more information piling up, and then it becomes so much more complicated. And obviously, once we go into space, it's going to become so much more complicated. Like, is it even possible for us to reverse back and, like, kind of, engineer from the beginning and think in a simple terms, the way that, a 5-year-old would understand, and the way we can do the business in space or acting space, or things will have to eventually just get to the point of we have to have, terabytes and probably servers of data running basically on policies and all of that. So do you think this is irreversible? It's just going to get too much complicated, or is there going to be a point where we have this kind of level and we know how the things operate?
Unfortunately, it's going to get more complicated. That is a solid given, because we have, with the onset of technology, we're seeing a diversification of things in space. Before, rockets were rockets, spacecrafts were spacecraft. They were manned or unmanned, satellites were satellites. We have rockets that come back and land on Earth, or like in ships. We have spacecraft that after they are in orbit, go back and can traverse to a different orbit. We have spacecraft that can shuttle another spacecraft into a different orbit. We have deorbiting satellites that can capture other satellites, whether they are willing or not, and like deorbit them. We have space shuttle, such as the X-47B that the US has been utilizing so far, that can actually go up there, capture something else, some other space asset, and then bring it back. We have all these new vehicles and instruments that's coming up, even for the moon. Before, if you would go to the moon, you had an orbiter, you had a lander. That was pretty much it. Now we have you have the Artemis Gateway program, which is going to be its own space station. We are going to have different space crafts out there. With the onset of AI, you would have different things piloting these assets out there, and it's going to be more complex to kind of find out the accountability aspect of this thing. Was it a human error? Was it an algorithm error? Was it an AI error? Who is accounting for that? How do we say that this was a probabilistic decision, or was a deterministic factor that was just preordained? No one knows. So the rule book will have to be thickened again and again to compensate for all these new factors that would be coming in as variables into the space sector.
Yes, it makes a lot of sense. Logically, it makes the sense, but logically at the same time, we thinking about from this kind of, little bit broader point of view, like why things cannot be simplistic, right? Why cannot things be simple? And obviously there is no way, because obviously space technology is just evolved so much, and we have to include rules for these specific, as you're saying, automation, propulsion systems, and all the deorbiting. So these different scenarios have to be regulated, right? And that's where it piles up over time. But again, what I see is one thing, like all the conversation that like goes around, like everything that we're talking right now, we're talking about kind of advanced developed countries, right? But I don't know exactly the number, maybe you can correct me at that. I think it's like where, like in 30%, 40% of the world still doesn't have an internet connection or something like that. So maybe it's going into crazy land with these numbers, but leave a comment, by the way, guys. Let me know. But there is a big disparity when it comes to countries, and especially in space technology development. So is that going to involve into, and of course we have US now with the Space Force, right? Space Force. So is that going to become a threat for those kind of third world countries who don't even have the internet yet? Not even talking about developing space technology. Like, is that going to become a case as we go into kind of this fantasy world where we see, two big leaders kind of controlling the entire world? Like, is that going to be the case, or like, how's the situation is going to unfold?
Thankfully, we won't have to see such a Cold War era space race again. One thing that we're seeing right now is the diversification of all space actors, as I previously mentioned. And again, like before, I did say that the rulebook is only going to get thicker and thicker and thicker. But one way that the rulebook can be thinner is if you have more of international regime that could look over these things. Right now, all the difficult thing about space law is that law is still based out of states. It is based out of nation actors. The thing about the space is that it is becoming more interconnected than ever. You have a UAE satellite that has been paid for by the UAE, but has been developed by South Korea and has been launched by ESA's Arianespace, but is operated out of Norway, but is still paid by the UAE. All these are interconnected web of assets that say, okay, then who is legally responsible when this satellite has a problem? Is it the country that manufactured it? Is it the country that launched it? Is it the country that is operating it? Is it the country that has ownership over this asset? Different regulatory regimes can come into place for different problems that occur. So what we could hope is that in order to offset this interconnected complexities, that we could, in some near horizon, an international regulatory regime that will not comprehensively compensate for it, but for a lot of the civil arena of space would have some international coherent set of rule book for it. It won't have much of a legal binding, because if you try to have anything legal, then national security, as soon as national security comes into play, things get a lot more complicated. But as long as things stay in the civil and scientific and commercial sector, we could benefit by the laws of the private sector, which is a bit more developed internationally around. We could see some instruments that will cater to that arena. So that way we could see things becoming more simplified. And in that way, we also see that the powers are becoming more and more distributed and democratized among the nations. Like the US and the Soviet Union used to have a monopoly over the space sector. Now we're seeing that a country don't have to have the entire spectrum of capabilities. Like a country does not need to have a rocket in order to have a say in space. They don't even need to own any space assets to have something in space, because if they have the financial assets to control or finance different space assets, then that nation can have a say in it. So in one way, we're seeing the democratization of the space sector, because you don't require so much hardware, you don't require so much technology. You can have only the operational side of space. So you can only have the manufacturing side of space. You can only have the finance side of space or the policy side of space, and you can still have a lot of say in how the space arena is being operated. In that way, I mean, I'm more of an optimist when it comes to space law and policy. I hope that with this new onset of powers and power distribution that is happening out there, we could see a more peaceful use of space. Yes, the U.S. Space Force has been there, but again, the U.S. has had a military interest in space for a long, long time. So has Russia. China also has its own space military regime. The Japanese ministries are also having something like a space force. But again, they are still on there for the preservation of national security. None of them are trying to attack any other country yet, other from ASAT, anti-satellite weaponry that's being developed, but that's another topic. So right now, no country wants to jeopardize their interest in space by being the first country to lead an offensive into space. A lot of the countries right now have an incentive to brand themselves as the peacemaker, as the peacekeepers in space, and introducing instruments and assets that say, we're here in peace. And that hopefully, with like the more interconnectedness, like when you attack something American, you're just not attacking America. You're attacking a lot of other countries out there. You will antagonize so many countries by enacting a problem in one asset. So with that interconnectedness, it is more difficult for you to wage a war, to wage a battle in space. So hopefully with that in place, it will give us a buffer to find a more peacekeeping regime in the space sector.
Exactly. And the word is hopefully, again, in this case, as I said, because obviously, like, I want to see this positive outlook, and I want things to unfold in a good way. And it's not going to be the worst case scenario, as I have this picture in my head just now. But you know, again, we don't see, because life is really complicated. And once we're talking right now, there's stuff happening at this exact moment. Somebody's is breaching country's border, and they kind of trying to take the country's like land while we speak. So, and these things are happening on a global scale, and you know, like, it feels like we're these human beings, like, you know, like we're developed monkeys with the Windows 95 computers, like, you know. So like, we really still don't understand what the life is all about. And for me, like, it's like, I'm a peaceful human being, and I would love for everybody to understand, like, at the end of the day, we all live on this huge, like, blue marble, like on this, you know, pale blue dot, as Carl Sagan said. So for us, we need to understand that. And I think part of that is a space flight. And I think some of those leaders need to go to space and appreciate this pale blue dot, and understand that at the end of the day, we all live here in this land, and it doesn't matter where you go, it's home. You know, it's home for us, and it has to be the home, and we have to treat it as home. And if we're gonna go to the other planets and you know, start living in there, you know, fully, so that's just another home. You know, so, you know, my wish and hope, again, in that case, that would be that some of those leaders, you know, will become one of those kind of frontiers in the industry, and start to make those steps towards kind of making life for everybody kind of as a home. But again, we see a lot of different problems that we're facing here on the planet. So, you know, I don't know. The way things look right now, it doesn't look good, but things change, you know, like, things stay bad, they change, they stay good, they change. So that's how the life goes. So look, really interesting conversation to do with you, Antonio. I mean, a lot of great information. I'm sure we can uncover much more, but look, I would love for people to get in contact with you, and obviously, you know, ask those questions if they are you actually available? Do you provide some sort of a consulting, or for the space industry companies, like, maybe you can tell where people can find you, and how much you could potentially help them?
Yeah, so again, if you need any help, you can always find me on my LinkedIn. I also like post some content on Instagram as well. So if you want to follow me, that's great. If you have any specific questions, I'm pretty sure if you contact Martinez, he'll be able to have you reach out to me as well. But again, if you want a direct means of communicating, you can always send me something on LinkedIn, or you can also like send, if it's like something really casual, something like, oh, are we gonna actually go in space? Or if it's just casual conversation, you can just hit me up on Instagram. I will be able to answer you there on the more casual questions. If you have more serious proposals, send me something on LinkedIn. We'll be able to start off the connection there.
Here you go. Here you go. So I do advise that because, you know, even for me now, while we're having the conversation, I'm thinking about the importance of it. And obviously, you know, I had a few of these conversations before, and everybody individually, obviously the information is there. So I do assume you do research and you read up articles, talk with people, that's necessary. But at the end of the day, people have different values, belief systems, and the way they come across, sometimes they say things because that matters for them the most. So that's why it's good to talk with, you know, more than a few people. And I think, you know, for the people like Cornell would say, oh, I've been talking with the people and with space law, it's always to get different perspectives and different point of view. So, you know, make sure to get in contact with Antonio for that. So again, thanks much for coming over today. I really enjoyed it. I wish you a lot of luck, and hopefully we can catch up sometime again and discuss the updates of the future and what's happening at that current moment. So thank you, Antonio.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you. Okay, guys, so before we're gonna go, one thing that I want to ask you, if you share this episode with your friends, if you find this episode valuable as much as I did, look, this is great information, huge topic. So if you pass this episode along to the space enthusiast who's already in the space industry, he's doing something or she's doing something, it's gonna be a great episode for them to watch as well. So again, thank you guys for watching or listening to this episode, and I'll talk to you very soon. Thanks.